Good afternoon, everyone from a very warm and sunny Dakar in Senegal. You're all welcome to this discussion hosted by the Open Society Foundations and United Cities and Local Government. My name is Tem Mbuh, and I work with the Open Society Initiative for West Africa. For those of you who are joining us using other languages than English, please note that there's simultaneous interpretation into French, Russian, Spanish, and Portuguese. You will find instructions on how to connect to the various language channels in the chat box. Now, today's event is the second in a three-part series on mandatory detention. These panels are part of the UN 75 Dialogues, an initiative led by the United Nations as it marks its 75th anniversary in 2020. The vision of the dialogues is to spark conversations around the world on priorities for the future and the role of international cooperation in resolving global challenges. Our panels will examine how the UN and its member states could adopt alternatives to mandatory detention to meet people's aspirations to safety and order. As a sponsor of the UN 75 campaign and the world's largest funder of human rights and civil society, the Open Society Foundations believe that the voices of those directly affected by mandatory detention need to be heard and taken into account in the search for solutions. The panels therefore bring together people with a lived experience of mandatory detention from across different communities in the globe, and those who work very closely with those affected by mandatory detention. As the largest global partner of local and regional governments in the world, UCLG brings together, represents, and defends local and regional governments at global level. As a convener of the Global Task Force of Local and Regional Governments before the UN, UCLG has coordinated a global consultation with local and regional governments that fed into a visioning report for 2045, calling for a world driven by communities that ensure effective social inclusion policies for the well-being of all, including the most vulnerable. Eradicating discriminatory policies based on gender, age, religion, ethnic heritage, disability, sexual orientation, and tackling false narratives that often frame invisible populations as the cause of crisis. Through the Cities Are Listening experience within which this discussion is framed, UCLG has set a very structural dialogue with civil society and other actors to move forward in unison towards a pact for the future in which no one is left behind. For those of you who tuned in yesterday, you would have noticed that the discussions highlighted the global dimensions of mandatory detention and how racism, colonialism, white supremacy, discrimination, and nebulous economic and political interests have all conspired to push a narrative that mandatory detention is a magic wand that can fix our safety and security challenges. Across the globe, this narrative has led to expensive and inefficient policies which overwhelmingly victimize already vulnerable populations. Today's panel will highlight the concrete negative ramifications of some of these policies in our communities. From yesterday's discussions, it is very clear that there is need for a paradigm shift to create more people-centered and humane systems. I will now introduce today's moderator, today's keynote speaker for our discussion, Salvatore Martello. Salvatore Martello is the mayor of Lampedusa, a small island in the heart of the Mediterranean, whose coast is sadly known for witnessing continuous tragedies of people sinking in attempts to reach Europe. He advocates for rights-based approaches to ensure right protection and solidarity to make sure that the Mediterranean is a sea of peace. With the pandemic, Lampedusa has become a hotspot that has undergone a lot of changes, with a rise in hostility and distorted narratives about migrants in the territory. He will make his remarks through a recorded video. After he speaks, I'll turn to today's moderator of the discussions, Sarah Bilal. Sarah Bilal is the founder and director of Justice Project Pakistan, an organization that represents vulnerable Pakistani prisoners facing the harshest punishments at home and abroad, and seeks to reform the criminal justice system in the country. Now, before I turn over to our keynote speaker, we will start off today's discussion with a recorded video from the president of the Open Society Foundations, Patrick Gaspard, who will set the stage for the discussions to follow. Please, can we have Patrick's video?
Hello, everyone. I'm Patrick Gaspard, president of the Open Society Foundations. I'm grateful for this incredibly important series of conversations about the harms done by the rise of mandatory detention around the globe and the path to a better world. I want to thank our friends and our partners with UN 75 Global Dialogues and United Cities and Local Governments, with the Cities Are Listening initiative, along with my esteemed colleagues across the Open Society Network who have been working tirelessly to think through not just how we got here, but how we take up leadership from those directly impacted to pave the road to meaningful change. This conversation is, of course, all the more important because of COVID-19. It brings it a new urgency. The news of surging caseloads, scarce hospital beds, and shortages of equipment frightens all of us. But for people held captive in detention facilities, it is terrifying. Living in crowded conditions, where the idea of social distancing is a joke, many of them are sitting ducks. The public health safeguards are weakest, we find, in places where they are needed most. Let's be clear about our terms. When folks hear the words mandatory detention, they think mostly about jails and prisons. But we know the population affected by these draconian policies is much broader than that. We're talking about immigration centers, psychiatric facilities, substance abuse treatment centers, anywhere people held in compulsory coercive confinement. We need to include all of these settings in our conversations, as people are often moved from one to another. They're all punitive in their way and intrude on people's health and human rights, even when detainees are held in the name of health. There is no place on the planet safe from the scourge of mandatory detention. In the US, the continuation of Jim Crow policies and systemic racism in the criminal justice system have led to disproportionate numbers of Black people behind bars. Marginalized populations the world over know their pain. In Australia, it's Aboriginal Australians. In Italy, it's North African migrants. Trans women in Mexico. Those in poverty across the continent of Africa, from Kenya to Nigeria to South Africa, and those who use drugs in Thailand and the Philippines, and on and on and on. The scourge has spread through the specious belief that locking people up in detention facilities makes us safer. Research exposes this premise as myth, but the effect on the safety and health of those detained and their communities is clear. The harms run the gamut. For too many people, just don't survive mandatory detention, whether it's due to lifelong sentences, violence at the hands of prison guards, violence amongst prisoners themselves, or due to neglect, dying alone in a cell. The human costs are incalculable, but we know the financial costs. European taxpayers, for example, spend $18 billion per year housing and managing pretrial detainees. In the US, the average cost of detaining a juvenile is higher than a year's tuition at Harvard. Imagine a world in which those funds don't go into locking doors, but into thriving communities. If only governments would shelve their ineffective and expensive punitive policies and prevent crime by investing in community-led solutions, housing, education, health, and economic development instead. Today's discussion will focus on where we are at the moment, the current state of mandatory detention. I hope you can also join us tomorrow when we imagine a better future, a world in which we replace punishment with compassion, lowering the profound cost to society of this over-reliance on incarceration and investing instead in effective, community-centered policies that heal rather than harm, replacing despair with possibility. In making that journey from the world as it is today to the world of tomorrow, we'll be guided by the experience and wise counsel of directly impacted communities from Kenya to Kyrgyzstan, the US to Ukraine, Lesbos to Sierra Leone. Without their engagement, we will surely lose our way. I look forward to the discussion and thank you again for your partnership. When civil society joins forces meaningfully with local governments and local communities, there is no limit to what we can accomplish together.
Sono Dottor Martello, sindaco di Lampedusa e Linosa, e vorrei salutare tutti i partecipanti a questo convegno. Ma da noi, quando arrivano i migranti, sia spontaneamente sia accompagnati dalle forze dell'ordine e dalle motovedette, attraccano al Molo Favaloro, vengono visitati tutti coloro i quali scendono dalle imbarcazioni e poi con i pullman vengono accompagnati direttamente all'interno dell'hotspot, cioè nel centro che abbiamo a Lampedusa. E dopodiché incomincia la procedura sanitaria dove tutti vengono, gli viene fatto a tutti il tampone e quindi vengono separati. I positivi vengono portati in una palazzina che è messa in disparte all'interno dello stesso centro e quelli che risultano negativi praticamente incominciano le procedure di riconoscimento con le forze dell'ordine. Devo dire che nell'ultimo periodo i riconoscimenti subiscono molti ritardi perché la situazione di controllo è diventata molto più qualificata. Sono arrivati macchinari nuovi e la procedura è molto lenta prima di dare l'ok per essere trasferiti sulle navi quarantene che aspettano nel porto alternativo di Cala Pisana. Finite le procedure vengono accompagnati sulle navi quarantene. Quando la nave quarantena è piena delle persone che vengono sempre lì separate in un ponte vengono messi positivi, in un altro ponte vengono messi negativi e poi gli altri ponti servono per il personale della nave e per le forze di polizia e della Croce Rossa che assistono i migranti che sono all'interno della nave. E una volta che la nave è carica prende il largo e viene sostituita da un'altra nave sempre sul posto lì a Lampedusa. La situazione, diciamo, da quando c'è il Covid, diciamo che i protocolli sanitari sono stati rispettati. L'unico problema che abbiamo avuto quando c'è stato il sovraffollamento dell'hotspot, sia sono venuti, diminuivano i controlli sanitari, sia anche i controlli dal punto di vista della polizia. E difatti noi abbiamo lanciato l'allarme su questo argomento perché non potevamo assistere che all'interno dell'hotspot che potevamo contenere 200-300 persone si arrivasse a un numero esagerato come 1500 persone all'interno dell'hotspot. Ecco perché poi il Ministero degli Interni ha messo le navi quarantene cercando di mantenere un equilibrio fra le persone che stanno all'interno e quelli che vengono trasferiti sulla terraferma. Entro 24-48 ore vengono immediatamente trasferiti, quindi il tempo di fare le visite mediche, di fare i tamponi, avere i risultati e poi fare i riconoscimenti, immediatamente vengono trasferiti sulle navi quarantena. Ecco, questo è un punto importante perché nelle nuove proposte che sono arrivate da parte dell'Unione Europea, che tentano di trasformare praticamente i centri di accoglienza all'interno delle zone di frontiere come se fossero centri di permanenza, nel senso che tutta la procedura del rimpatrio o dello spostamento può durare un mese, ma come può durare anche un anno. E quindi dopodiché su questo argomento, se non vengono prese decisioni e venga raggiunta una certa, come si dice, compattezza anche da parte dell'Unione Europea, noi rischiamo di trasformare i posti di frontiera come tante Lesbo in Europa. Già abbiamo difficoltà quando andiamo in sovrannumero all'interno dell'hotspot. Voi pensate in un'isola così piccola di 22 km quadrati, dove si vuole realizzare un centro con 6, 7, 8 mila persone. Che cosa significa? Cioè significa che praticamente i migranti sono più della popolazione. Ma poi, come si dice, la ricaduta sul territorio sarebbe una ricaduta talmente negativa che metterebbe veramente in ginocchio, anche, non parlo solo della sensibilità, ma anche lo stesso ragionamento dell'ordine pubblico. Il fenomeno dell'emigrazione rientra all'interno di un contesto molto più generale che fa parte delle guerre. Le guerre ecologiche, le guerre ambientali, le guerre con le bombe, eccetera, eccetera. Vorremmo lanciare un messaggio molto forte dal centro del Mediterraneo, visto e considerato che fino ad oggi si è parlato solo di morti, di affondamenti, di cadaveri e di persone che soffrono per venire in Europa. E vogliamo che l'anno prossimo sia l'anno per la pace, dove vogliamo lanciare questo messaggio per fare diventare il Mediterraneo un Mediterraneo di pace, non un Mediterraneo di morte.